to the call for submissions that we made at the last meeting. We received a large number of submissions, and that's helped Harriet and Fiona pull together some proposed recommendations which I thought we could discuss today and come to an understanding of, and that would then allow Harriet and Fiona to perhaps prepare a draft report for the group to discuss at the next meeting in anticipation of making a submission this side of summer to government. So this afternoon's discussion will be about the proposed recommendations that have been drafted as a result of the submissions that many of you have made to Harriet and Fiona. And I understand that everyone has got a copy of the proposed policy recommendations. I understand that's been circulated. If anybody doesn't have it, could they stick their hand up, and maybe Harriet or Fiona could email you a copy as we're on. Okay, so I'm just taking it as read that everyone then has a copy of the policy recommendations. So perhaps if we can turn to those policy recommendations and just really work our way through them over the course of the next hour and see what agreement we can reach on the policy recommendations. Before we do that, I'll just invite Harriet if she's got any preliminary comments to make them now before we go through each of the recommendations. And perhaps I could invite you, Harriet, maybe to take us through each of the recommendations. So over to Harriet.
Thanks, Alberto. Hi everybody, so nice to see you. Yeah, so we've come up with a range of recommendations based on the couple of roundtables that we've had in the past, and also me and Fiona have just been talking and emailing you all about your proposed recommendations. So we have 7 at the moment. The first we've kind of divided them into sections. So the first section is about the legal framework. So the first one is to introduce legislation and standards that requires microfiber filters to be fitted into all new domestic and commercial washing machines by 2030, and all new washing machines are retrofitted with microfiber filters by 2035. And the second one is to introduce an extended producer responsibility for textiles by 2025. And these powers would be similar to the ones that have just come in the Environment Bill on plastic packaging. Number 3 is to introduce mandatory eco-labelling to indicate the presence of a filter on a washing machine product. This will help provide further information about the product to consumers. And then the next section is about standards, because we've had conversations in the past roundtable about what we would do to empty the filter, etc. So number 4 is to create an environmental quality standard for plastics. The Environment Agency would then be able to set limits to emissions of plastics and microplastics. So this would then be the Environment Agency setting these standards onto the water industry. Number 5 is to create a standard which ensures consumers are aware of how to correctly dispose of microfiber waste from their washing machine filter. Number 6 is to do with kind of public awareness and governance. So number 6 is to appoint a designated minister for plastics and give a new cross-departmental minister with the remit of plastic pollution. Number 7 is to emphasise the role of education and consumer awareness to work with educational and cultural institutions and NGOs. So we have just put a little note there that this could include, but is not limited to, a call for a further consultation or further research into the feasibility of embedding education on plastics into existing curriculum. So me and Fiona have done a little bit of research about schools and the curriculum and how much plastic is included. So that's something that we could potentially look into as well.
Thank you, Harry. So shall we kick off, Harry, with the first one, the introduction of legislation? Do you want to maybe just tell us a little bit about that, how you came to put that one together, and then we can go round and just have a chat about that one?
Yeah, sure. So number 1 came about through just our conversations, and obviously the consultation, which was mainly, the consultation was mainly on filters. We put the provisional date of 2030. That was quite realistic for us, but we're willing to chat about that. So if anybody has any thoughts on the dates, that would be great. But that's just something feasibility wise, and the current kind of what's going on with legislation in Parliament now is what we could see would be feasible. So if anybody has any comments on the dates or the wording around number 1, that would be great.
Harriet.
Hi, Francis.
Hi, it's Frank Thomas from APPG. I apologise, I don't have the option to put my hand up, so forgive me for jumping in. On the issue of retrofitting, I just wanted to flag something up there. As you probably know, manufacturers of appliances, including washing machines, over recent years have moved their business models strongly towards providing more durable, long-living appliances. So it's not unfeasible for an appliance to go on the market today for it to still be functioning in 2035. Now, given that means that appliance manufacturer would need to comply with legislation on this 2035 date, which there's no standard, there's no regulation stating what that filter should comprise, what that dimension should be, what its capacity should be. So they would need to comply with legislation they are not yet aware with for appliances that will go on the market, as I say, today or in the months or in the years ahead. So just something to bear in mind there when you're thinking about a 2035 date is to think about how long an appliance can last these days. And you could actually, I can see 2035 being seen as a target date for appliances which haven't yet been made, but so because of the durability these days, you could easily find appliances that go in the market today are still functioning in 2035. Thank you.
Just respond to Francis's comment, because I think that's a really good point when it comes to kind of dates. We're obviously, as the Marine Conservation Society, sort of disappointed to see a date that's so far in the future in terms of having microfiber filters fitted. And, if you're talking about, as Francis sort of rightly pointed out, there's an increase about durability of these products. So if you're talking about introducing it in 2030, rather than the French date of 2025, which obviously is feasible, possible, practical, otherwise they wouldn't have put it in, means that effectively you're putting an extra 5 years worth of washing machines going onto the market, and we're going to see the impacts of that. And then you've got the challenge of, well, what do you do with those products that don't have the microfiber filters fitted? As Francis pointed out, that challenge of kind of retrofitting is a huge one, and therefore we want to see these kind of filters come in earlier. And I think as the Marine Conservation Society, we've sort of said we want to see retrofitting on commercial machines because they have an extremely long kind of lifespan generally. I mean, I'm no expert in washing machines, but I've heard from people that there's still ones running from the kind of 60s in some of these kind of commercial laundrettes. So we really need to kind of focus and understand, well, what is feasible, but that date would align then with the French legislation. And crucially, that is good, I would say, for kind of a lot of manufacturers, that they're going to have consistency in what they're being asked across Europe. I appreciate we're no longer in the EU, but across Europe, and I think that's really good. One of the key things that this government keeps talking about is when we exited the EU, that we wouldn't see environmental kind of quality go down. And I do have a couple of other little comments, but I'll sort of save those because I just wanted to respond to that particular point in the date, and I'll come back with some of the later points on some of the other questions or bullet points.
If I could come back on some of that, it's Andrew Mullen from Becco.
Could I just invite, Natalie and Ian in that order? So Natalie, Ian, and then you, Andrew. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course, no problem. Of course.
Ian and then Andrew. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm terrible for just throwing that hand up straight away, aren't I? That's the problem. Within the retrofitting part of that is the issue that really sticks out for me as well, because there is no point putting into any form of legislation something that you can't monitor and police to ensure its effectiveness. So within that, especially as you're going to be looking at potentially kind of hundreds of thousands of households and commercial enterprises that you need to be observing within that regard, is there actually the capacity there to ensure that this legislation is being taken up and people are complying with it in different ways, particularly within the home? And in that regard, is it more worth pushing voluntary uptake and pushing commercial side, as has been already stated, for getting actual filters within existing washing machines quicker? Just as a kind of perspective of what is achievable and what we can enforce and what we can encourage people to do. And I'll shut up again.
Thank you. Ian and then Andrew.
I saw your hand, put your hand, Natalie, and thought, oh, I'll do that. And actually, it's very much linked to the point that you've just raised, specifically on retrofitting. Over 90% of UK homes have got a washing machine, which means there's 25 million out there. So whether this is a question or a thought for consideration is, how will that not only, as you say, Natalie, be policed or monitored? How will it be achieved? How do you get filters to those homes? Is it the consumer that fits them? Asking a consumer to do anything is hard for many, many reasons. There's also a risk if you're asking a consumer to do something to a electromechanical machine, that can bring a potential risk. I think this point particularly is worth exploring in how it can be achieved and then monitored to understand its effectiveness as well.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm like Frank. I don't have the option of putting my hand up, so I had to just jump in. There was a couple of points I was going to make. Firstly, I agree with Ian. I think retrofitting on machines is going to be a real challenge. And to come back on Laura's point about the French legislation, I think as manufacturers, we don't believe that the 2025 aspiration is necessarily achievable. And if it is, I suspect that will be based on a very, very limited market. But I think the key point I wanted to make was, if we do want to get these filters in quickly, of course, they don't have to be put in the machine. There are external filters available on the market now, and therefore, if there's a desire to have retrofitting, it could be external rather than internal, and it could be done without or separate from the washing machine manufacturers themselves.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much. Yeah, a couple of points. First of all, thank you very much for the policy document. Really impressed with the ground that's been covered in it. We obviously have a few points of view in terms of mandating filters in domestic and commercial washing machines. We absolutely believe that is the right thing to do. As I just pointed out on the chat, 9 million machines will be sold in the UK between now and 2030. 9 million. So that is getting on for halving the retrofit problem of 25 million that was just described. So we strongly feel that that date, while we probably understand where some of that might have come from, it kind of aligns with the Australian position. It is indeed 5 years behind other European countries, and those countries use the same platform for the manufacture of their machines than we do in the UK. So I suppose there's probably a slight challenge here in terms of that date. When someone starts selling a machine in the next year with a microfiber filter in it, how can the manufacturers of washing machines state that it's going to take that long to be able to develop this technology when there's already products coming to market with this installed, including Beko, I think? So we feel that this is something that can be achieved quickly. Certainly my company is very happy to talk to any manufacturer that wants to make use of our particular technological solution. And if we allow things to drift on till 2030, and sorry, drift is probably not the best term, if we allow things to go on till 2030, in that time, 9 million machines will have been sold in the UK and 37,000 tons of microfibers will have gone into the environment. So there is a real cost associated with delay, but we are really delighted that the view is that this should be mandated. We absolutely support that. If we question anything, it would just be the ambition. other countries are doing this quicker. I genuinely don't understand why we wouldn't. But thank you.
And next, I saw whose hand did I see? I can see Tanya and Natalie, but there was somebody else that wanted to come in. Howard. So Howard, Tanya, and Natalie in that order. Howard.
Yeah,
Tanya,
I'm a marine biologist, and I've been studying microplastics for longer than I care to remember. And I think what we're all forgetting is how horribly toxic these chemicals are. You know, we now know that they are toxic directly to phytoplankton in our oceans, and also to the zooplankton. And really, we all depend upon the oceans as our life support system for the planet. And we have lost more than 50% of all the life in the oceans, partially due to microplastics. And I've actually recently published a paper in Ocean Science on that subject. But one thing that we shouldn't forget either is that none of the effluent treatment systems, municipal effluent treatment systems, are fitted with tertiary treatment to remove microplastics. So if we want a quick hit to this, then we, I think, have to focus on municipal water treatment, because that's where a high majority of our plastics are escaping into the environment. Now, sure, we have to also fit microplastic filters onto washing machines, because the more we can reduce that, then the easier it is to remove them at the point of discharge. But from what I understand of the washing machine microfilters, is that at best they might remove 70 or 80% of the plastic from the discharge water. We really have to get to a point where we do no harm to the environment. We have to be zero discharge of these chemicals, because it's not just the plastic itself. The plastic contains chemicals which are also horribly toxic, like oxybenzone, which is toxic at 62 parts per trillion. 5 milliliters of that chemical would wipe out most life in 100 Olympic-sized swimming pools, for the equivalent. The other aspect is that microplastics escaping into the environment absorb other chemicals, hydrophobic lipophilic chemicals, and that makes them 100 times more toxic. So we should be looking at zero discharge of these particles as soon as possible. And the easiest quick hit we can do is make the water industry actually filter the discharge. And that way we deal with it very quickly. And that could be done at a relatively low cost. It's not new technology. Technology is all out there. And then, of course, we try and do that also for the washing machines. So the more we can do this, the better. So we can't wait for 10 years. That would be ridiculous.
Thank you, Howard. I really want to focus on recommendation 1. I'm going to take Tanya, Natalie, Kevin, and Richard. Then I want to bring the discussion in as to what we can agree when it comes to recommendation 1. So Tanya, Natalie, Kevin, and Richard in that order. Tanya.
Yes, thank you. I was really going to concur with Christian in as much that I think now the technology exists. It certainly exists, certainly a matter of producing filters that can be applied internally and externally into machines. And why would we wait? I think we risk getting behind Europe, and machines here that there'll be an influx of machines here that aren't up to scratch. We end up risking being the ones where they're dumped, the machines that are not up to scratch, and then that'll even delay having machines that can be fitted. So just really to concur that the dates need to come in because the timings can work.
Thank you, Natalie.
Just as a way of getting around this waiting for our very talented white goods manufacturers to introduce their new technologies, is there a way that we could, within this legislation, put in a mandate that any filter that is sold that does not have, any washing machine that is sold that does not have an internal filter must be sold with an external alternative? So we can see partnerships between some of these really good design alternatives that are coming in. It doesn't exclude anybody that isn't in the current process of developing a filter from that part of the market. And they potentially shorten that period of time that we need to wait for this to be implemented.
Thank you. Kevin, Richard, and finally, Kevin, Richard, please.
Thank you, Alberto. I just really wanted to echo very much what Andrew and Ian said about retrofitting. I have some obvious concerns around that. And then I also wanted just to echo Howard's point, actually. I mean, I talked about this a little bit last time we met about I think that the focus is slightly wrong here. We have a source where we know microplastics are gathering, and we should be focusing, I believe, on tackling that issue and making the polluter pay for that technology and that innovation in technology. Whilst you can, of course, make a recommendation to add filtration units on washing machines, it doesn't solve the problem, it solves part of a problem.
Thank you, Kevin. And finally, Richard.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I just was slightly worried we could go down a rabbit hole, and I think we're all in agreement that filters make sense, but it's a question of the degree. And I think it is important that we consider this in the round, and maybe we revisit this when we've looked at some of the other recommendations. My overarching point is that the source of this stuff is actually the design of the textiles in the first place. You know, we've already had research that shows that emissions can be reduced by at least 80% by different types of design of textile. And what would worry me about our initiative is if we don't flag that up clear, if the idea of fitting a filter is a distraction, if it allows us to continue with current practices around design. So we must make sure that we're working on a number of streams in parallel. Filters, yes, are part of the picture, but also the redesign of textiles to be more sustainable, to last longer and to shed less fibers is absolutely key. I don't completely agree that wastewater treatment is high on the agenda. It is relatively efficient, actually, capturing 98% or so in an advanced wastewater treatment plant. But, you know, not everybody has the benefit of such a wastewater treatment plant, if we think about this globally. And also not everybody has the benefit of a washing machine. So ultimately, we crack this best by moving to the source. And the source isn't wastewater treatment. It's actually a lack of full consideration at the design. So I think I just would urge us to think about a number of measures proceeding in parallel, rather than saying it's wastewater treatment and not filters on washing machines, or design and not filters. It's a combination of all of them. And I think we need to make sure that an action on one doesn't somehow deflect attention or the importance away from some of the others, because I think we're only ultimately going to solve this by better design.
I'm going to try and bring together now the various streams of recommendation one. I think there's unanimity that there needs to be some form of action. I think we can start comfortably that we're agreed that microplastics being emitted is an issue. And we've had that discussion. The question is, how best do we approach parliamentarians to make a recommendation that is sound and that has some legs to it? And I think from one side, we've got Richard, who made the final comments there about looking at the textiles themselves. And I think that's a very good idea. And I think Harry and Fiona have already considered that. And we can flesh out recommendation 2 and the other recommendations that they've made in respect of textiles. But I really want to try and get some agreement somewhere. And we've got to start somewhere, because with a discussion like this, and this is the concern I had when we had our very first meeting, with a discussion like this, we can open up so wide that we agree on nothing. And I think we need to agree on something. We're not the only country that's started on water machine filtrations, both domestic and commercial. And I think even our manufacturers, who I very much welcome on board on this group, I think they're in agreement that there needs to be something done. 1 or 2 manufacturers have already voluntarily taken it upon themselves to do some introduction. So what I don't want this to be seen is a stick, the recommendation to be a global, a holistic recommendation to beat the head of washing machine manufacturers. This is not what this is about. It's trying to find solutions to a problem that we all acknowledge. And it's going to be a sort of Catholic approach. There's a universality to this, but I do think we need to start to identify those recommendations that will assist in aggregate in building up that picture. And washing machine filtrations, I think, is certainly one of them. Now, from the other side of the spectrum, we've got the issue of date. Some of you have been arguing that 2030 is too far in the future. but we really ought to have a date that's closer. So let me now make a suggestion to the group. My suggestion is that we go with recommendation 1 and we bring forward the date. Now, what this recommendation will allow us to do is to have these discussions with other stakeholders, with a wider manufacturing industry, with the relevant government departments. And that in itself will help to refine any recommendation that we make. But I think that starting off with a recommendation, as it roughly is, brought forward, will allow us to kickstart those discussions. And I think 1 or 2 of our manufacturers who've already got in the pipeline the idea of putting filtration systems into the machine, I'm sure they will see this as a benefit in terms of being able to argue. They may disagree on the date, but I think in terms of being able to argue and being able to distinguish themselves from the other competition. But I do want to emphasise that washing machine filtration systems of their own are not a solution. They're part of a solution. But I think we have to start today somewhere. And so I think with recommendation 1, what I've sort of gathered is there is general support for the idea, some dispute on dates, but there's general support. Can I get confirmation from the group that there's general support for recommendation 1? Good. Can we now then move to, sorry, just before we do, this doesn't stop industry and manufacturers of washing machines to further help us refine recommendation 1. So I'm looking to them to make further submissions to Fiona and Harriet about recommendation 1. And when it comes to drafting the report, that we will then send before anything's finalised, we'll distribute the report, the draft report. We can then go through that and further refine recommendation 1. Can I now move to recommendation 2? Harriet, would you like to give us an outline of that, and how does that chime with the comments made by Richard?
Yes, recommendation 2 is on EPR. EPR is when the person who produces the product then takes responsibility to what happens for it. So it kind of creates a circular economy. The government are bringing it in for plastic packaging in 2025, and this was in the Environment Bill that's just going through Parliament now. So they've also, the government have mentioned introducing it to textiles and also tyres, which we know are another source of microplastics, but that's a whole other topic. So number 2, we just wanted to get your thoughts on EPR for textiles for 2025. We believe that date is feasible considering all of the work that's been undertaken to do with the plastics industry, and therefore can kind of be similarly transferred to the textiles industry.
Thank you, Harriet. Now, again, I'm relying on hands, and forgive me for those that aren't able to use the hand. Can you use either the chat box or another way of getting my attention? But Howard, I don't know if that's a historic hand. Tanya, I don't know if that's a historic hand. Do you want to shake your heads? Is a contemporary one? So I'm going to start firstly with Sophie, who's got a hand up, and then we'll move to Tanya.
Hi, thank you. Maybe we can start by just a little bit more clarity of how you actually see this working in this topic, because microfibers, microfragments, a very, very just different kettle of fish to a plastic bag or plastic packaging. What I'm really curious to understand is how we would actually put this back as producer responsibility when we're talking about such tiny kind of size in this. So although it does fall in the same area as plastic and plastic packaging, the scale of what we're looking at is a very, very different thing. So I think timing wise approach needs to be kind of outlined before we can actually get into the discussion around this, because I think we might want to do it, but if it's not feasible, then that's going to obviously make it quite tricky for us to implement it.
Thank you. And Tanya.
Apologies, I didn't take it down after my last question. Apologies for that.
Who else would like to contribute on this point? Well, then can I put it to the group? Are you in agreement with recommendation 2 as proposed? Well, we've got Kevin and Ian. Okay, Kevin and Ian before I come to that.
Sorry, thank you, Alberto. I think I totally support EPR. It's something I mentioned at the last meeting. I think we need to be clear, if we're going to introduce EPR, what are we asking the polluter to pay for? So whilst you might want to set standards for improving textiles and reduce the loss of microfibers during use, I think it's really important that you're asking them to pay for the pollution that they are causing, and therefore, what is the focus for that activity?
Thank you, Kevin. Ian and Adam.
Thank you, Alberto. And actually, my point was very similar to Kevin's. It may also be something we might cover in the later part on standards, but not only what are we asking the polluter to pay for, how are we measuring what they're actually paying for? So in terms of what actually is a microfiber, the size, the definition, so there's actually clarity on that. So in terms of if there is whether it be a cost, a taxation, how to define what that relates to, I think is going to be very important as well.
Thank you. And Adam.
Thank you. I suppose I wasn't on the first one, so my name's Adam Root. I'm the founder of Matter. I think there's a few people around the table that might know my face through one way or another. I just wanted to say just a quick point on this. We're involved in the commercial and industrial side, so we kind of talk to the washing machine guys, the wastewater treatment plants, and the textiles people in between. And my kind of feeling on this really is about, I think there's a real opportunity to set up a textiles recycling element of this. I think if we're talking about creating effectively a new waste stream, if you're going to be capturing all of this microplastic, this has got to go somewhere. I think this needs research and development to do that, and there needs to be cash to make that happen. I think there's a real opportunity to use this extended producer responsibility to help drive the recycling of microplastic to add value to this material. There certainly needs to be stability in the recycling sector. And we've seen this being quite successful in other parts. So I would like to advocate this. I think it's positive. I think it also it makes people think about what material they're producing with. They have choice when they're at the design phase, as Richard mentioned before. So if there is an opportunity to reduce this, I think there is. In regards to the nitty-gritty of what is microplastic, how that works, I think it's we can go into that, but I think that's probably a bit of a deeper conversation. Thank you, Alberto.
Thank you, Adam. Laura, I think you would like to come in. You had a point that you wanted to make.
Yes, thanks. It's just on sort of EPR. I think we need to be very clear on what we're asking for EPR. Are we asking just around the concept of textiles? So you're talking about fashion, so you're talking about, more recycling bins, let's say, for textiles, versus, the issue that we're talking here is about sort of microfibers and microfiber capture. Now, obviously, if there's more reuse of clothes, then we're going to have less microfibers, because we know those first couple of washes are particularly detrimental in the amount of microfibers that are released. But I think we need to be kind of clear what we're asking for in that EPR. So, for instance, in the single-use plastic directive that some of you may be familiar with, there's a sort of what I describe as sort of super EPR, in the sense that it has quite a lot of other asks in that. So it talks about consumer awareness campaigns, cleanup costs, for example. That would be a big one to note. So there is kind of precedence for EPR being beyond perhaps just the, hey, we're going to collect material. It talks about the other aspects within that. So I would sort of urge that if we're going to talk about EPR in terms of textiles and the microfibers, that actually we take a look at what's in the single-use plastic directive and make a strong nod to looking at some of the things that they've incorporated, which go beyond just the cost of collection and maybe the cost of just recycling. And I think that will help to push other things that people like Richard have pointed out, looking at kind of standards for that, things like that, and I think will then help to kind of progress this issue around microfiber shedding.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on this issue? Okay, so I'm getting the impression that this is slightly more problematic than recommendation 1. Is that the consensus? Does anybody want to argue against what I've just said?
I think, Alberto, it's just about the clarity of
Yeah.
the extended responsibility. I think everybody's pro polluter paying, but it's just about how and make it really work. I think it has to effectively generate a solution.
Yes, I think recommendation 2 has to be thought through. Harriet, do you want to come in?
Yes, sorry. Recommendation 2, obviously these recommendations are very broad. You probably have already worked that out, and that's kind of the point of them, to be broad. But recommendation 2, we're happy to refine it. If I'm being completely honest, I didn't think through how it would actually work in practical terms. But that's something that we could explore further if anybody wants to submit sort of what their thoughts after this meeting to me and Fiona on number 2, then we're quite happy to take suggestions and look into it further.
Well, can I have to specifically confirm Harriet's request there that you would make some submissions to help her and Fiona redraft? Who might like to help with that request?
Atta can help if that's we can.
Adam, that'd be very helpful. And Richard, excellent. Adam and Richard. Okay, thank you. Can we now move to recommendation 3? Harriet.
Thank you. Recommendation 3 is a conversation that we'd had with me and Fiona with Oceana, who just had spoken to us about eco-labelling. It's one of the recommendations that we're a bit more sort of unsure about how it would work in practical terms, but kind of the aim of it was just to inform the consumer that there was a microfiber filter in the washing machine and that some action would need to be taken, you know, when it's full or something like that. We'd spoken to Beko about their notification on their washing machines with filters in, and they told us that the consumer would get an indication when the filter needs changing, which is a really good thing. Eco-labelling was just basically for the consumer to know that you have to do something here, you have to change the filter, there's a filter in here. So if anybody has any comments on having a label to describe that, would be good. Thank you.
I would hope this would be one of the least contentious of issues, but I can see that we've got Natalie, Adam and Tanya, and then Francis and Christian. So in that order, Natalie, Adam, Tanya, Francis and Christian on the issue of labelling.
I wouldn't say I'm finding it contentious. I am entirely for kind of increased transparency for the consumer, and I think it's a fantastic idea. What I would kind of recommend potentially in the long term, for a start, I wouldn't flag it as this has got a filter in it, you need to do more work when you're washing. I think that's going to be the wrong message to deliver. I think we want to be promoting rather than insinuating that you're going to have to spend more time doing laundry. But in the long term, as kind of Richard and colleagues have already shown, a filter is not a filter is not a filter. They are not all equal. So within the long term, as we get more information about how different types of filters work, a little bit more on their efficacy of different styles, different models, maybe having a color-coded system as to how effective these things can be in the long term. So if you are going to make decisions based on being slightly more sustainably minded, you can get a good idea from the outset of how effective you're likely to be in the long run. And I'll shut up.
Thank you, Andrew. You can come in after Christian. I've just seen you on the chat there. So next is Adam, Tanya, Francis, Christian and Andrew. Adam.
Thank you, Alberto. So I suppose my exposure to this is I was involved in the energy, the ERP labeling, which if some of the washing machine manufacturers might be wincing at the energy rating stuff that we did when I was at Dyson. And one of the things that was really key with this is I think it's a really big opportunity. You know, we've got decibels of the spin cycle. It'd be quite easy to put on there a standard for the filtration levels. They already exist. ASTM is the American standard, and you know, if you had a HEPA filtration standard, there's different things in air filtration. It wouldn't be rocket science to convert this over. That would be quite simple. and it also stops people from producing things that like producing a filter. In the vacuum cleaner industry, we saw a lot of people producing filters that were very high efficiency and then not sealing them. So the airflow went over this. So basically, they kind of got around it in some way or another. So I would be a big advocate, as my engineer at heart. I'm a big advocate of putting in a standard that is really, it's going to be ambitious, and we can use that A to G rating just the way as we are on ERP labeling. I think this will be very simple to do. From a practical point of view, I think maybe there'd be a huge trail of paperwork. I don't want to argue with that, but that's my opinion, if that helps.
Thank you, Adam. Tanya.
Yeah, actually, just really to confirm what Adam said, I think if you're going to do a standard, it needs to be about the efficacy of the product, really. And it can't just be that there's a filter there. It's got to really talk about how effective the whole system is. And that it's not just about the capture, it's about all of it. So a proper efficacy rating on there. Again, it can be done. If it's a disposable or not, that's going to be a different efficacy to a product that doesn't have a disposable element to it. So I think there will be elements to it, but that's something that can be worked through. I agree with it. I agree with it in principle.
Thank you, Tanya. Francis and Christian.
Thank you. It's actually, my point comes back to something that Adam just raised on the energy label. As you may know, washing machines have to be supplied with an energy label. I just want to flag something up. I would be tempted not to go down the route of putting any labeling on that energy label for this reason. In recent weeks, we've been covering an issue with the European Commission where an opinion was stressed, a non-binding opinion, I must stress, that an energy label with the EU flag couldn't be supplied in the same box as an energy label with the UK flag. Now, aptly, the Pan-European Appliance Trade Association have obtained a legal opinion to state that that is incorrect, and that so long as there's no confusion, customers aren't confused by the two labels, they can both go in the box. Now, part of that ruling was based on the fact that the technical data contained within the label is identical across both markets. If they were not identical, there could, I must stress, could be an issue, which could then also flag up, generate issues at the Northern Ireland border, where you've got flags with the energy labels with the UK flag not being permitted to go into Northern Ireland. So just be aware that there could be an issue with energy labels if you deviate from the EU methodology on the energy label.
Thank you, Francis. Christian?
Yes, thank you for that. So we absolutely are supportive of telling us. We think that's some information that they'd really like to know. So we'd be extremely supportive of it. There's probably a slight nuance here in that we believe that sharing the sharing.
Yep. Sorry, Christian.
Sorry. I think you froze a moment. Sharing the percentage capture rate is an important factor to show that not only is that filter doing what it's supposed to do, but it's also doing it in a way that's going to make an impact to the environmental output. And also the need for it to be capturing not just microplastics, but microfiber, cellulosic microfibers as well. I think I picked up the last bit of Francis's comments with regards to alignment to the EU labelling. We would say that, obviously that labelling process was subject to some industry legal challenge. So we would probably want to make sure that that is very, whatever labelling is put in place, it's very simple, it's very clear, informs the consumer. I would entirely echo Natalie's points around not telling the consumer that they've got more work to do. Certainly in our solution, they don't have more work to do. So this is just a way of informing the consumer that they are actually making a real difference to the environmental output.
I can see what I consider to be not a controversial recommendation is becoming fast a controversial recommendation. I'm looking at the chats online. Andrej.
Sorry, was that me?
No, it's I've got. Sorry, forgive me, Andrew. It's I think was it Andrew or Andrej who wanted to come in?
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
I just made a couple of comments in the chat. My raise hand doesn't function, so unfortunately. I just wanted to say that I'm really not in favor of labels. I think the minimum sort of requirement for a filtration system should be included in the regulation. And then, I mean, that has to be achieved by all the producers, everything on the market, really. So we don't have a problem with that, and we don't need labels, really. But there could be, you know, thought of a label on the shedding level of textiles. It relates to what Richard was talking, that textiles could be improved, but this has to be somehow told to the customers if they have a better textile that sheds less in their hand. Maybe just on the EPR point, I think there is a question, who or which sector, which industry, which players would be targeted by the EPR, and I would think that the textile industry would be it, and not washing machine producers. And then there's a question, what, of course, is the main goal with the funds from the EPR? And I think it should be emissions reduction rather than, let's say, focusing on the recycling and so on. I think that's a possibly secondary point. We need to reduce the emissions to start with, and that's the most crucial point. That much from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew, did you have your hand up earlier as well? Did I miss you out, Andrew?
Yeah, I did. I put something in the chat. So I think, you know, for all of us manufacturers, there isn't a meeting that we don't go to these days with DEFRA or BEIS or anybody within government where they don't think the solution to a problem isn't to put a label on a product. It's becoming, frankly, we are going to end up covering the entire product with labels the way things are going for eco design and for sustainability and reliability and spare parts and this. And all the evidence we've ever seen as manufacturers is that consumers don't look at labels, and we live in a market now where the vast majority of appliances are bought online. And so I understand why everybody thinks that we should go and shout about what we're doing, but in all honesty, the evidence is that customers don't really care. What they want is a product at a price, and sticking a label on the product won't fix the problem.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Is there anyone that I've missed out that is asked to speak? Forgive me if I've missed anyone out.
I've tried to get my name mentioned a few times.
Mark Taylor, yes. Feel free, Mark, on recommendation 3. Yes, on you go.
Oh, it's about all 3 of these recommendations.
All 3. You want to speak of all 3? On you
go. They're very washing machine focused, but the laundry cycle in most houses includes another machine that work done by Rachel Miller, who's in this call, and other people have spotted as well, is that tumble dryers potentially have a larger impact, and they launch their fibers directly into the atmosphere to float around and settle wherever, including on roads to be washed down the drains and just straight into the water courses. And I just wondered why we were ignoring those.
I don't think we're ignoring anything. We're open. We've got to sort of focus. Otherwise, we'll just come up with 1,001 recommendations, and that nobody will read the report. So we need to focus, and I'm actually relying on people like you to help us focus. So make the submissions and help us focus on what you consider to be the most important one, Mark. I didn't read any submission from you, I must confess. So help us in this task by helping us to focus. Look, I think when it comes to recommendation 3, what started out is what I thought an uncontroversial recommendation is one I think most of you think is too woolly and not really helpful. Is that right? Am I expressing that correctly, that it's not a recommendation that you think we should go for? Christian, I think, is maybe objecting. He thinks it's a recommendation we should, but I think the majority are saying it's not. Christian, I'll let you say one other comment for.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm monopolising my comments, but I would slightly challenge the point about consumers not reading labels. 80%, there has been, there have been studies on this where 80% of European consumers trust the labeling on their machine? Why for years have manufacturers been putting triple star ratings on their machine if consumers don't read them? That feels counterintuitive to me. So to say that labels don't matter, and for the avoidance of doubt, if I have the choice between microfiber filters going in a machine and putting a label on it, let's do the microfiber filter, absolutely. I'm very willing to give up the labeling in comparison. But the fact is, consumers want to know that their products do certain things, and labeling is an effective way of doing it. That doesn't mean to say you don't put that information online. That doesn't mean to say you don't put that information in the manual. But let's tell consumers what they're buying.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw the discussion on recommendation 3 to close. I think, notwithstanding Christian's valued comments, I think the majority feel that really looking at the more substantive recommendation of how we deal with microplastics is more important at this stage than labelling. So I think with that, we can probably, for the time being, in terms of the report that's going to be coming our way, is remove labelling, maybe mention it, but not as a recommendation at this stage. Okay, can I move now to, Harriet, to the set standards for the correct disposal of microplastics? Would you like to talk about recommendation 4?
Yeah, sure. Recommendation 4 is on environmental quality standards, for plastics. So there are environmental quality standards for different things like zinc, mercury in water, that the Environment Agency put out. There is a list on their website that you can go and find. And we just thought, why not make one for plastics? Because then the Environment Agency would be able to set limits on the water industry. So this is kind of linked to the water industry. We've all talked about the water industry before as an issue. So if everybody could just give their feedback on what they think about that.
Thank you. Who would like to go first? Ian, is that a historic hand, or are you indicating you'd like to go first?
That's a new one, if that's okay.
Absolutely, fine.
Thank you, Alberto. And it relates to my previous points. It's perhaps more relevant here, which was, I think, in a reference here about the standards. I think it would be helpful to say standard of the definition of a microplastic and then the disposal of it. And I think I know Francis has previously provided, I think, some link of work that's being done in some EU member states on this field as well. So I think it'll just be worth referring to that link and to make it helpful, so we know the disposal of what effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Tanya.
Thank you. Yes, I think we felt that we were fundamentally in agreement with some standards, but I think, as all of these things, that it is perhaps a little bit more to it. I mean, we felt that they should be not just water, but airborne as well, which would bring in the tumble dryers and some of the other things that have been mentioned today. And it would need an approach for domestic, industrial and commercial. So yes, supportive, but again, perhaps needs some clarification and some different, widening out. Certainly airborne and waterborne, two different things, but means the same thing.
Thank you, Tanya. I mean, Andrew put in a very interesting comment on the chat about tumble dryers. But again, I'm happy in the report to widen it out if that's what the group wants. Anything to get government to talk with stakeholders about what we need to do, whether it's on textiles or washing machine filtration systems. Okay, Laura, did you want to come in on recommendation 4? And then Henry.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was just to say, and currently under EQS, the Environment Agency doesn't do any routine monitoring on microplastics. So before they get to actually set sort of limits, etc., then we need to actually be monitoring to understand some of the root sources of where microplastics come from. So quite often people say, oh, the water companies do the monitoring of microplastics. They don't do it on a routine level. They do discrete projects, but not routine. So I think that's a really important first recommendation, is actually for the EQS, that actually there has to be routine monitoring, and that could be air, water, marine, etc. And I think that is an important first step.
Thank you. Henry.
Thanks. And my point will kind of lead on from Laura's. I think anything we give to the Environment Agency to do, we kind of need to recognise how limited they are with funding, time and resources. So this is a broader point to kind of take note of. If the Environment Agency are to do anything, they need to have the proper resources to do this.
Thank you. Any other comments about recommendation 4? No, I mean, it's a very broad recommendation. I think that the points that have been made are very helpful in terms of the restrictions that the Environment Agency have. I must confess, in my work as a parliamentarian, whenever I deal with the Environment Agency, I'm all too aware of how restricted they are in a whole range of issues to do with the environment. But that doesn't stop us as a group saying to government, again, whether it's the Environment Agency or it's another stakeholder taxpayer funded body that should have responsibility for creating these standards. I think this is the whole point of this recommendation, really just to get the government thinking about it. I'm persuaded to keep recommendation 4 in unless someone can persuade me otherwise. Anybody want to give a go? Gianluca.
Yes, just the one thing a note about the standard. As you know, that in Europe, we created a consortium dedicated for the microfibers, where the major home appliances plus others are members to develop a standard that after they want to submit to the Senelec for a vision of standard. But actually, you know, we continue to talking about dryers and the washing machine. Here, I think that we need to distinguish, because, for example, this working group is dedicated only for the washing machine, because I think that is something different. From my point of view, you know, I listen everything that you said about the filters and so on. I think that is the solution, the filter in this moment, but we need to open also to some other possible things that could be maybe some different from the filter. I don't know, what do you think? I'm a member in this consortium, and of course during this meeting I want to return to you and explain what we are doing, especially for some proposal, because I think that we need to have something common everywhere, not only talking about Europe, UK, but globally, because inside there are a lot of other tables open in the US, Australia, and now I heard that also in the Middle East, they start talking about the microfibers. To avoid to create some differentiation, I think that the key point is to have a common system that is made. I think that maybe the idea starts from this consortium, and after we move in the Senelec to define this.
Thank you, Gianluca. Before I move to Richard, Kevin says, can we have a conversation about the priority of these recommendations? Yes, when we have the draft report. I think we need to just agree on the substance of these recommendations, whether we want them in or out. And if we have them in, then we can flesh out the report and decide which has most priority. Richard.
So I think it's back to points that have been raised along the line. I think we need, we need measures here to tackle things at a number of different points. The filters are important, but actually what you're talking about here, it's linked to emissions if I look at the text. And I think that if we nuance that to looking at emissions, to me, the point of emission is as it leaves the textile. So if for this particular bullet point, we're going for the textile and improved textile design, then that solves it at the point of emission. And it will also help to see into the long grass, if you like, this wider issue that it isn't just about washing machines, it's also the fibers released while you wear them and while you tumble dry them. So I would say with respect to this bullet point, it's about emissions from the textile. And I think this is what we need to do through the whole document. You're absolutely right, Alberto. We can't deal with everything all in one go, but I think some of our aspirations need to be kind of overarching, and others of them need to be specifically focused at the filters, which are something that we got immediately in our site. So I would urge for this bullet point to capture everything, and in terms of reducing the emission from the source, and that being the yarns and the textiles.
I think that's a very good point, and I like the use of the word aspiration, and that's ultimately what this report is all about. It's an aspiration that we holistically agree to. We may disagree with some of the finer points of each recommendation, but holistically we agree to the aspiration overall that we need to tackle emissions from source, and we have then subcategories of recommendations which all help and contribute. That's a very well made point, Richard, and one that has to be taken on board. I'm mindful of time, and I do want to press ahead, but I'll take Natalie's comment on this recommendation before we move forward.
Thanks, Alberto, and sorry everyone else. I just noticed that a couple of times there have been questions regarding definition and how we're referring to microplastic or particularly microfibers that have come up within the chat. And I think that actually using the word microfiber rather than fiber is potentially creating an artificial point of contention here. I don't think anybody's suggesting that if it's above 1 millimeter in size or 5 millimeters in size that we should just let it through. And equally with the lower end of that definition as well. And also to the same extent with looking at kind of synthetic or natural, let's not go into the cellulosics versus non-cellulosics, etc. types of fibers. I think that there's a lot that we can do looking at the issue of textile fiber release as a whole. And to echo a lot of the previous points on emission standards, a lot of emission standards are set by knowing the levels at which something becomes harmful within the environment. And there's a long way to go before we know exactly what level is our okay standard for stuff within the environment as well. I agree with the earlier point that there needs to be some baseline testing that's out there at a multitude of points. But within that, looking at emissions, are we going to have DEFRA people following us around, double checking our fabrics as we move around the street, or where is the best point to check those things as well? So while I agree that we should know about the shedding rates from types of clothing, one of the best ways to monitor how successful some of these measures is by looking at kind of that end of the pipe assessment of what's coming through there. So it's pairing up these quality standards with what we're actually trying to measure. So is it fiber release from the textile, or is it the efficacy of some of these measures that we're putting in place to reduce the amount of plastics that's coming through the pipe, as it were? So I think within that kind of point 4, there's kind of a point 4A, there's a point 4B and a point 4C that we should potentially be looking at.
I mean, Mark makes a point in the chat that goes back to our first meeting about definition. Because of course microfibers can include natural fibers, and we're now discovering that natural fibers are not breaking down, are not as biodegradable as we first thought. They do biodegrade, but we've noticed in landfill natural microfibers that are still in existence 60, 70 years after they were covered over with soil. So it's a big issue, but again, we're going to have an awful problem if we have a report that's so open and vague that it concludes nothing. And I do think we have to try and focus where we can. Now, Mark suggests fibre fragmentation rather than simply use of microfiber. As a politician, microfiber and microplastics is an easy sort of terminology for those of us in Parliament to understand, but it may not meet the definition of those of you in academia. But I think for those of us in politics, microfibers and microplastics, we can very readily understand what is meant by that. But I do like the phrase fibre fragmentation as well. Now, I think what we sort of, when it comes to recommendation 4, I think most of you feel that yes, there is clearly a need to have a set of standards, but what those standards are and which body should it be is not agreed. But I do think we need to focus somewhere and help government say, look, we think there needs to be a set of standards. You need to have the conversation as government with further stakeholders, and we're suggesting we kick it off with the Environment Agency as a start. Whether that's the ultimate body that eventually is agreed remains to be seen. Can I move to recommendation 5, please, to create, Harriet, would you like to give an overview of that, please?
Roberto, recommendation 5 is, you may have noticed, it's obviously a very broad recommendation again. So it's more just about whether, we have talked about this, whether there is scope for a waste stream for microfibers. And me and Fiona did discuss about putting number 5 into section 3 because it kind of covers consumer awareness. But it's just basically, it depends obviously on what filter is put in each washing machine, but it's just basically to ensure that consumers are aware of how to correctly dispose their microfiber waste. So we talked about before, when you have a vacuum cleaner, the consumer knows that you need to put the fluff in the bin. Once your Hoover bag is full, it was kind of linked to that. So just a standard of potential waste stream, if possible, for the what's produced by the washing machine.
Thank you, Harriet. Look, recommendation 5. I mean, you could say create standards which help ensure consumer. We could make it even more woolly. Create standards which help ensure consumers are aware of how to correctly dispose of microfiber waste. Now, in our first meeting, we discussed about, well, people at the moment, when they collect, as I do with my tumble dryer, is I pick up the fluff and put it straight into the bin, which goes straight into landfill. There is no correct way of disposing microfiber waste. But by having this discussion, by even bringing it to government and saying, well, maybe there should be a correct way of how you dispose of this material rather than sticking it into landfill, that in itself, I think, helps to create the debate that we want on this subject. I'm going to take Richard, Kevin, and then Tanya and Francis. Richard, Kevin, Tanya, and Francis.
So, I mean, I think in answer to your remark, Alberto, there are inappropriate ways of disposing of these fibres, and I'd far rather you put them in the bin and they went to landfill than, and this is going to seem, but there could easily be a tendency amongst the consumer, if they didn't realise what they were trying to achieve here, of rinsing out the filter under the tap and letting them flow into wastewater, and you defeated the whole point. So I think some guidance would be helpful. Just finally, what I'm thinking as I look through the recommendations, I just wonder if we perhaps ought to consider reorganizing or regrouping them, because this one, it clearly directly links to if we're going to have a filter in place, and if we're having a filter in place, what are the standards for that filter? And I just wonder if we want to group these recommendations. I mean, there's a number of ways you could do it, but is it short, medium, and longer term that, we've got this aspiration that, yeah, an ultimate solution might be better design of textiles, but we've also got a range of measures that are associated with the idea of the filters, and that relates to whether you're going to fit them, whether you're going to retrofit them, if you're going to have them, is there going to be a standard for the machine, and is there also going to be some guidance for the consumer? So I just wonder if there's a way that we could regroup some of the text so that it's clear which bit we're heading towards. But I would urge there is a need to give some guidance on what good looks like, even though landfill, isn't ideal. It's better than ending up in the sea.
Yes, Richard, forgive me, that's a point, you raise a very valid point that Kevin raised, and Kevin's coming next, about the prioritisation of these recommendations. And my response to Kevin is, look, when we draft the report, we'll bring it to the committee, and then we can identify which are the more important recommendations. But for what it's worth, the notes I've been taking, Richard, is the report really ought to start off, in terms of structure, I think really start off with your speciality in textiles, emissions from the textiles, the textile design, and then you work it through. If I could use sort of oil industry terminology, upstream, and then you go downstream to the washing machine, the tumble dryer, the municipal filters. That's broadly what I've got in mind now with this report, as I hear everybody throw in their piece and present that draft report to you, and then we can further refine it.
If it's any use, we've got an infographic for that we can share. It just shows that as a pipeline, exactly what you just said. It
That'd
shows
be
all the
very
streams.
helpful.
Yeah, that's fine.
Very helpful, Adam, if you could share that with Harriet and Fiona. Kevin.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Alberto. Just picking up on that point, that was the purpose of me raising the issue about priority is just that very fact about making sure that what we do is address the issue first and then the solutions. And just very simply, I think there's a very simple, quick win to the proposal here. So in the WEEE regulations, there is a requirement in the WEEE regulations for producers to provide information to users. So when you buy an electronic device in either the manual or online, there will be information about how you correctly dispose of that device. So I don't think we need standards here. We just need a requirement in the regulations that information is provided to consumers in whatever format is seen as feasible and also productive.
Thank you, Kevin. And Tanya.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things talking about aspiration and perhaps following on what Richard was talking about is what does good look like here? And I think this is where, we could put things forward along the lines of perhaps from some of the producer responsibility scheme payments, but curbside collection, there could easily be solutions. We all want this material back. It needs to be fully circular. And as our aspiration, that's what we should be aiming for, and to put some systems in place and perhaps paid for by those producer responsibility schemes. It's aspirational, but we're certainly working on that with our products to make them fully circular. So, don't rule that out.
Thank you. I've then got Francis, Mark and Sophie.
Thank you, Alberto. Just leading on from Kevin's previous point, the national standards body in the UK, as you know, is BSI, but the standards they produce, they are chargeable documents. You have to pay for them, and they're quite expensive. And I just think we should note that any informative or normative information that consumers need to access, and I stress consumers, that needs to be free of charge.
Francis. Mark.
It's sort of related to what Francis has just said, but so if you've read many standards that have come out of BSI or SEN, you'll know that often there's basically a requirement in the standard for what marking and labeling must go on a product. So the standards you discuss in point 1 that we discussed earlier should also include what's on your point 5 here, that they're basically the same point. It goes back to what Richard says. So if you look at, say, climbing helmets, there's a massive tract of text in there about how this helmet, it's not guaranteed to save your life, but it might, and things like that. And it has to be basically copied word for word into the labeling that goes on the product when it's sold. So that's how you get this information across. Whether the consumer would read it and follow it or not is a completely different thing. But this would be included in that standard that the BSI or whoever produced for the filters or the washing machines with filters that you're going to mandate from point 1, I think.
Thank you, Mark. Sophie?
Yeah, I'm just going back to Tanya's point about raising funds from the EPR. We would love to see more funds coming to the manufacturing and the design level. I think, as I said in previous meetings and also in the TMC recommendations for this policy document, we are doing a huge amount of work, and that has all been done without private or public funding. So, to Richard's point and everybody else's point around design, it is very feasible, but we need the funds. So if we can actually put the emphasis back to the government to provide funds around this, because I think this area, because it is so small and it's a small part in a much larger sustainability agenda, it's often forgotten with regards to funding. So, we can, demonstrate through the work that we've done through very, very minimal funding what can be done, and we can definitely accelerate and deepen that with the suitable funds that are actually required. But I think putting the responsibility back to the supplier to generate those funds is not going to necessarily work, because they're already pushed in so many different directions. So just really wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Is there anybody else that wants to make any comment about recommendation 5? No, I think the general consensus there is that much more work again on this very open recommendation needs to be done. And I think the points that you've made have all been very helpful and will be taken into account in the report. Can I move on to recommendation 6, Harriet?
Thanks, Alberto. Recommendation 6 is part of the last section, which is about consumer awareness. So it would be to appoint a designated Minister for Plastics and give a new cross-departmental minister a remit for the control and prevention of plastic pollution.
Can I ask you just to talk about recommendation 7 as well? We'll take both 6 and 7 together.
Yeah, sure. Number 7 is just to emphasise the role of education and consumer awareness and to work with educational and cultural institutions. So we've just put a note at the bottom there that this could include, but it's not limited to, a call for consultation for further research into the feasibility of embedding educational plastics. Me and Fiona have done some preliminary research on this about what's in the curriculum and how we could spread awareness through schools.
Thank you, Harriet. Who would like to kickstart the discussions on 6 and 7? So I've got Adam and Kevin. Adam and Kevin.
Thank you, Alberto. Sorry, Kevin, do you want to go first?
No, go on, Adam.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. I suppose I just had a couple of points. One of them we talk about. I know we're trying to not go too broad, but we are talking about microplastics. And if we say Minister for Plastics, it does feel like it's the witch hunt a little bit. From my opinion, I think there's an opportunity to do. If it was to be Minister of Pollution, I think that would be something I'd be very supportive of. I think there's a real big opportunity for this across the different streams. We are, as a company, we look at car tire stuff as well as the microfibers and the other bits and pieces along that microplastic stream. I think it would be something I would kind of advocate to have someone that can have some real teeth. We talked about the Environment Agency are doing some great work, but they don't have a lot of resources. If there's a minister behind them that can help, I think this is a great way of supporting that. I'd be supportive of that. And then the final one was about, if we're going to talk about 6 and 7, the last part about education. I am incredibly pro education in this space. I think there's some amazing work going on with a lot of NGOs. I know they're not on the call, but Common Seas have done. I've got some educational pieces. We've got some connections there we can help with. Marine Conservation Society, of course, got some incredible bits and pieces that I think we can put in here. I believe that to solve this problem properly, it's research and development, which is technology which didn't exist 5 years ago. Fundamentally, education, telling people about this problem, and then legislation about what we're doing today. So I'm super pro both of these points, if that's helpful.
Well, I'm glad that from plastic you moved to pollution, because it kept the P. I was thinking of the acronym MOP for the new minister, which I thought was highly appropriate and would certainly get media attention.
It's very important.
Recommendation. So
yeah.
If it was pollution, we would keep that acronym, I think. But if we can move to Kevin and Sophie, please.
Yeah, so my point once again relates back to the WE regulations. I think at the moment producers are funding communication campaigns to all sectors of society, and I think that's a better proposal than simply targeting education in schools. Education in schools would be part of it, but it shouldn't just necessarily be the focus. I have a wife who's a teacher, and every time there's a recommendation on TV for another thing for kids to be taught in school, you hear her with a big sigh of anguish. But yeah, I think the WE regulations and the UK WE system currently gives you a framework for which there could be a communication strategy for educating all consumers about plastic. That, of course, is funded by an extended producer responsibility scheme based on who the polluter is.
Thank you, Kevin. I've got Sophie, Christian and Natalie.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back on Adam's point. I think Minister for Pollution is far better fit than Minister of Plastics. I think, you know, as Mark brought up earlier, this isn't just a plastics problem, it goes right across all sorts of fibre types. So I would support that. And I think emphasise the role of education. I think there's definitely a need for education the whole way down the supply chain. TMC is currently facilitating the development of a cross-industry roadmap on this topic, and education is one part of that. And we really see that if we can educate the manufacturers from raw material all the way through to garment, as well as the design communities at the brand and retail level with an aligned approach, that really is something that's very much needed at the moment. So support of those two things.
Thank you. I've got Christian, Natalie and Henry.
Yes, thank you. Just in terms of combination on 6 and 7, just a couple of very small points, but if we could try and cover microfibers in its broadest definition, because, you know, to your point, Alberto, cellulosic material is just as bad as plastics, and we need to deal with it. It's not something that we can simply choose to ignore. Absolutely, I'll be interested to see whether you get any volunteers for that post with that title. But a pollution focus sounds like a really interesting piece. But I think on the education piece, which I would echo, you know, colleagues' comments on that, and absolutely support right up and down the organisations, but also across the public. There is a need to recognise that this is not an issue that it's easy to produce interesting photography for. You can't show a turtle covered in microplastics because you can't see them. This is an enormous problem, and far, far greater than straws and other pieces which get a lot of public interest and focus, but actually are a small problem in comparison to this great big issue that we're trying to deal with. So that education piece absolutely is a key part, and I'd support Adam's perspective on that. But also there is a need for legislation, there is a need for technology to be able to address this issue head on right away. So no, thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Before I turn to Natalie, Henry and then Richard, the Ministry of Plastic, the Minister of Plastic was just a title Harriet and I came up with. Francis asks, is there any appetite within government for a Minister of Plastics? I'll tell you this, politically, it'd be much easier for me to say to Boris, why don't you have a Minister for Plastics, than it would for a Minister for Pollution. The title itself, politically, plastic is an issue. We all know that it's a great substance that humans have come up with, but it's a major problem for us as we go forward in our environment. And it may well be an ask that might have some legs on it. So I take the points that are being made about Minister for Pollution that's much more appropriate than Minister for Plastics. But remember, I'm dealing with politics, and presentation is often an important point of this. So Natalie, Henry, and then Richard, and then I'll draw the discussion to a conclusion.
So I'm hoping mine will be quite, I'm just kind of coming back on that point on more things for teachers, to be honest. I know that there are a great deal of excellent citizen science projects around on plastics. I've kind of been involved with a few myself. I know colleagues on this call have some that are upcoming as well. And I think that what we should be focusing on, if we are going to aim things at education level, is not the topic itself in isolation, but how it can be curriculum linked. So here, rather than looking at individual topics, we look at the outcomes of things like being up in Scotland, the curriculum for excellence, and how we can create teacher packs which remove the need for some of our embattled colleagues to do that groundwork, and they know that they can just slot that into their teaching schedule at the point at which they should be teaching. Maybe it's statistical approaches, maybe it's looking at ecosystem service levels, etc., etc. So I would say that there's also a lot of expertise out there within the university sector from the citizen science side, and also the NGO sector that can be pooled for that to actually put this in place incredibly quickly, as in before the start of the next school year. This is one of those things that we can start now, start early and get rolling with. Whereas a lot of the other things that we've talked about are certainly down the line. So we can potentially prepare an audience for when we have some of these options out there.
Thank you. Just before I bring in Henry and Richard to conclude, I'll just invite Harriet to make a point about education.
Yeah, sorry, it's just following on Natalie's point. Me and Fiona had trawled the curriculum for any mention of plastics and how it could link in with other subjects. We've also had conversations with people who write the curriculum or have written the basis of exams, etc. And there seems to be an appetite for, as Natalie said, kind of including it in all subjects, whether that just be just kind of briefly mentioning it in subjects like chemistry, geography, history, and just how it all interlinks. I personally, I didn't take geography as an option at school, but I didn't do anything to do with the environment past year 9, I don't think. So, and there are environment schools that do exist, but that's teacher led. The teachers then decide to register as an environment school, and then it's for them to decide, what they teach the children on the environment side. So it's just something that we could consider and then recommend, as we said in there, that there could potentially be another consultation on that.
Thank you, Harry. And finally, Henry and Richard, and then I'll draw the conclusion to a discussion to an end.
Brilliant, thanks, Alberto. Just to follow up on those points, I think linking the plastic conversation and the plastic education towards climate change, as you suggested in the policy, is a really strong idea. It's not quite understood by many people, but it's definitely a hook that will definitely get some attention. And on the Minister for Plastics, yeah, I'm not sure how many volunteers would sign up for the hardest job in government to be the Minister for Pollution. But a step down from that potentially is just to ask for an overarching policy on plastic pollution. Maybe it's a bit of a step too far to have a minister, but to have that cross-government policy on reducing all forms of plastic pollution could be a good ask.
Just before I invite Richard in, an unrelated issue, Nadhim Zahawi is the Vaccines Minister for the United Kingdom, unpaid. And this guy is working at breakneck speed, and he's turning around the most mammoth logistical undertaking outside of wartime that this country's ever known. I think there would be one or two people up for this challenge in government to take on the role of an issue that we know is a major problem, and we have to come up with some solutions to it as we go forward. Politics is not easy. It is a complex human endeavour, and there are many parliamentarians that would revel at the opportunity of taking on the role of having this jurisdiction of looking at how we deal with this. Richard, I'm going to give you the final word, and then I'll bring all the conclusion, the discussion to an end, rather. Richard.
So on the minister, I've got some caution here. I mean, I think there's something that we can learn from almost the mistakes that we've inadvertently made about the way we've designed, used, and disposed of plastics, and it's kind of crept up on us as a problem. And I think we all need to find a way to look on that and to reflect and to try to use it to guide us to better use of our planet, if you like. And I think we can learn from the mistakes. And if we were to capture something in government, I think it's about that. I'm hesitant that if you get somebody that's attacking this with the critical eagerness that we needed for the virus, that the problem is that we've got lots of environmental science evidence about the issue, but we have very little evidence about the solutions and the trade-offs between solutions and which solution to apply best in which circumstances. And so what I worry is that we could get, solutions coming in or being lobbied for that actually were untested. So we need more evidence before we have somebody kind of going at this. We need to act urgently, but I'm just slightly worried that it isn't that everything's all stacked up, ready to be delivered, and it's waiting for somebody, like the rollout of a vaccine program. So it just a note of caution there. But I think we can learn from the mistakes. That's the key thing: how to learn to move forward more efficiently. On the education, I think there's a number of things been mentioned here. And of course, education is really critical. And at one stage, we're talking about wider awareness at schools. I don't think that's education at schools about filters on washing machines. At the other end of the scale, there's sort of something that's more akin to public awareness, and that might be about the washing machine filters, or it might be about putting your recycling out or whatever. And it feels more like a kind of anti-smoking campaign or a wear your seatbelt campaign. And so we need both. I have some hesitation that at the moment, the system that we've got, the circular system that we might hope for, isn't quite there. And there's a risk, if we're not careful, that we're advocating or guiding people towards a system that's slightly broken. So I'm not sure we're quite ready for a wide-scale public education campaign about this is the answer to solve the problem. I do think we're ready for wider scale education about the issues. And I absolutely echo, I think it was Natalie's point, that needs to be all the way along the supply chain. If we were designing better, smarter products in the first place, some of the issues we've talked about today wouldn't be there. We wouldn't be having to face them. So it has to be along the supply chain. I sometimes see the consumer picked out as, well, they're the ones that are going to let us down. We're doing all this great stuff to make recyclable products, and these consumers are going to let us down. And I think that's a mistake. We've got to work together on this right the way along the supply chain.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, for those comments. I'm mindful of time. We've kept the discussion to 1.5 hours, and I'm very glad of that. I think we've had a good round discussion about some proposed recommendations. That's all that these recommendations are. They're not hard and fast set in tablets of stone. They're just proposed recommendations to get us talking. Now, let me now share with you how I would like to go forward. One of the great advantages of having set up this all-party group for microplastics is that I've brought a very wide range of stakeholders on board. Harriet's done a brilliant job with Fiona of contacting some of you from the world of academia, some of you from the world of manufacturing and industry, others from the third sector and charity, and so on. And that's great because we're getting all your different views on what you think should be how we should tackle this particular issue. The disadvantage to me as a politician is because I've allowed this group to have such a wide range of stakeholders that it makes it very difficult to try and narrow down those ideas that can crystallise into agreed policies. And so I'm going to ask your indulgence of all of you, which is this. In politics, I always have this at the forefront of my mind. Perfection should never be the enemy of what is good, never. So I'm mindful that some of you will be a bit anxious, particularly manufacturers, of going down a route of washing machine filtration and bringing the date forward to 2025 or something like that. And others will say this is a waste of time. Instead of doing that, there's many fibres that are shed in tyres and tumble dryers and all sorts of other things, and textile being emitted there. The fact is we'll get nowhere. And so I am going to ask your indulgence and say where we can at least attempt to agree on some measures that may assist in tackling this, and that are reasonable measures. They're not undue, they're not unfair and unduly burdensome on one particular industry over another. I think we should try and coalesce where we can around agreement in a report. So Harriet and Fiona are going to draft up a report, and it's going to be based on the comments that you've made today and in previous meetings, and we will circulate that report. And it's very easy to be critical, and it's very easy to say, I don't agree with this, don't agree with that. What I want to hear is what you can agree with, and what I want to hear is improving it rather than just red pen crossing out everything. That's ever too easy. That's all, politics is really challenging and complex, particularly with an area like this. So I would very much value and welcome your constructive criticism, but your acquiescence, at the very least, to where you feel you can agree to in the report, so that we at least can produce a document this side of summer which will kickstart the debate in government, where I can present to government, where I can present to the House of Commons a report that has the agreement of a very wide range of stakeholders with their own diverse interests. So if you're happy to proceed on that basis, that's the way I propose to go forward. Is there anything that anybody would like to say as a final comment that we haven't mentioned, is that they're burning desire for them to say before we bring this afternoon's deliberations to a conclusion?
How about Alberto? What is the time scale for the next stage?
Very good question. We don't have it fixed in stone. I'm mindful that we're already in mid-April, and the House will rise for its summer, no doubt, mid-July. So I would have thought that we would want to get something to government this side of summer, with an opportunity for me maybe to raise it in the chamber. And then in autumn, winter time, have debates in the chamber on specific headings of the report, and we can agree on what those are. I can apply for various debates in the chamber with other parliamentarians that are taking part in this group's activities. So this side of summer to try and agree a report. So if I say, Harriet, Fiona, if I'm being unfair, please let me know. If I say if we can get a report to you in a month's time, a draft report that you can look at and then go back to Harriet and Fiona for them to further refine. And then if we can have maybe a meeting in the second week of June, where we can hopefully, as I say, agree a report. And even if that report is all boiled down to education and that area, even if, if there's no agreement at all on water, washing machine filtration or whatever, fine. But as long as we can narrow it down to an area that we can agree on. So, Francis, I think that's the sort of timescale. In a month's time, having a draft report circulated by email, and then a further meeting in mid-June. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah. Just the last point, Alberto. If we can help in any way, I'm welcome to provide any support again in that respect. We did a very similar thing for the G7 for the ghost gear fishing nets, and put some policy together for that, and that went really well. So if I can help you at any point, then us and our team are here.
Very helpful, thank you. We'll note that, Adam, and we will take you up on that. Kevin, you've got your hand up. Is that a historic hand? It's a historic hand. Okay.
Something still needs to be said, Andre here.
Andre, okay. On you go. Say what you've got. A burning desire to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. It must be said. Alberto, thank you very much for doing this, for putting your weight behind it, for being patient and constructive. I think it must be said. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I think I'll bring the conclusions now to an end on that note. But thank you very much, all of you, for taking part in this. Thank you especially to Fiona and Harriet for the hard work that they're doing in trying to bring together all our ideas. And please do feed in further thoughts. But look out for a draft report by mid-May, and then we can take it from there. But in the meantime, I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Keep safe. And I look forward to seeing you all again at our next meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.